Next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Welcome to the City Club. I'm Paddy Tillett, President of the City Club, and I'd like to welcome you to a particularly timely City Club Friday Forum. Today we have an opportunity to learn about the people, culture, social structure and beliefs of Afghanistan and Pakistan from someone who knows them intimately. Neil Kenny Gaida, our speaker today, is Chief Executive Officer of Mercy Corps, an organization that has been assisting the impoverished of those two countries with humanitarian aid for over 15 years. But first, some announcements. Join us on Friday, October the 12th, for another topical and timely program on finding the appropriate balance between national security and civil liberties, and how that balance might have changed since September the 11th. Our speakers will be Jim Huffman, Dean of the Law School at Lewis and Clark College, and Mike Shrunk, Multnomah County District Attorney. That'll be here at the MAC. Please also watch your bulletins and list servers for announcements about a series of programs that our Business and Technology Issue Committee and our Government Services Committee are putting on in the aftermath of the 11th of September. The first such program was held last week at Kells Pub and drew a very good crowd. For more information, call Suzanne at the club office. All of you should have received a pledge card and a letter from me this week asking you to participate generously in this year's annual fund campaign. It's no coincidence that the City Club was brought into existence as the First World War shook our country in 1917. The civic values that the club champions and protects are all the more important in dark times such as these. The City Club has continued to cultivate leaders and has helped to inspire the growth of outstanding citizens in this community for 85 years now. Thanks to the generosity of our corporate friends and lead gifts from our Board of Governors and annual fund team members, we're already more than halfway to our annual goal. But we need your help to get there so that we can continue to pay back the community with outstanding research and important programs such as the one that you're engaging in today. www.pdxcityclub.org provides easy access research reports, past club program presentations, upcoming events, and membership information. And I think you'll be impressed by the quantity as well as the quality of the information that's available on our website. Our board host today is Dan Finley. He's member of the Board of Governors, and he's Director of Market Development with Learning.com. Dan will ask the first question of our speaker. After Dan's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members and our young guests in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone and before Dan has finished asking his question so that we can make the most of our speaker's time. Identify yourself as a City Club member and remember to ask your question in 30 seconds or less. And please, no declamations. It's very tempting on a topic like this to declaim, but please desist. And the other plea is, you know, last week we had the odd cell phone going off like an electronic bomb. We don't want any of those, please, so switch them off. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Legacy Health Systems, Pope & Talbot Incorporated, and Washington Mutual Savings Bank, and we're very grateful for their support. Neil Kenny Gaida is a remarkable man. He's invested his entrepreneurial expertise amongst the world's poorest and weakest and least represented. He began by working with at-risk minority high schoolers in Washington, D.C. and Atlanta in the 1970s. In 1980, he moved to Thailand to aid starving Cambodian refugees as a field coordinator for CARE and UNICEF. Then to Beirut with Save the Children Fund, and then to Somalia, Jordan, Gaza, and the West Bank, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Wherever war destroyed lives and the ability of ordinary people to survive, he was there to help. In 1990, Mr. Gaida Mr. Kenny Gaia returned to the United States to help aid organizations to become more effective. And in 1994, he became the Chief Executive Officer of Portland-based international aid agency Mercy Corps. And we have several of your number here, I'm very pleased to see. The agency now operates in 25 countries and has bettered the lives of some 5 million devastated individuals. In Afghanistan, Mercy Corps has completed more than 40 projects, aiding self-sufficiency as well as distributing food, clothing and equipment to 3,700 internally displaced families in the northeastern provinces of Takhar and Badakhshan. As many of you know, most of the basic necessities of life for ordinary folk in Afghanistan have been swept away by a decade of war with the Soviet Union. There's no TV, there are no cinemas, and what pass in newspapers are devoid of uncensored news and photographs. The Taliban forbids education of girls completely. Half of the 6.5 million refugees from Afghanistan have landed in Pakistan, where boys, many of whom are orphaned, are educated in 2,000 madaris, which are religious boarding schools. They arrive as hungry kids, and they leave as militants ready for the jihad. This is the devastating environment in which Mercy Corps has been working, and about which our speaker will talk to us this afternoon. So please welcome the CEO of Mercy Corps, Neil Kenny Gaia.
Patty, Dan, Nancy, thank you. Wish my mother could be here to hear that introduction. Although she probably would have reminded me I didn't take enough time to get a haircut. Let me thank the City Club for sponsoring this time together. And let me especially thank the people of Portland for showing such concern, caring, and compassion during these troubling times. And let me thank all of you for being here. It's a little bit overwhelming, and I'm honored to be standing before you today. I know we're here to talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan and the people there, and we will. But before, I'd like to just share a bit of some of my experiences over the last 2 weeks, because we've all been so touched. Our lives are forever changed. The tragedy of September 11th is a watershed whose aftermath and historic implications will be with us for a long, long time. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly gone through a riptide of emotions. I think we all have, from fear and grief, anger and sadness, and a firm resolve to get on with our lives. And get on with our lives we must. But we must get on with a new resolve to root out bigotry and violence and hate wherever we find it. Terrorists may destroy buildings and alter landscapes, but they must not be allowed to destroy our moral fiber, which we're going to need to carry on the protracted struggle against terrorism and for justice, at home and abroad. You know, and I don't know about you, but I've cried. I think we all have cried. I had the opportunity to go to New York, to Ground Zero, to see the work of Mercy Corps, our team there, and our partners, including the Dougy Center, who's a partner with Mercy Corps at Ground Zero in New York. They're doing great work. The teams there are doing great work. And I have to tell you, I was unprepared for the emotional tidal wave that overcame me. I was unprepared for the scale and extent of the destruction, so unbelievably overwhelming. As I walked amidst and through the ruins of the World Trade Center, I thought of the many, many lives lost in the ruins and the many, many more who had lost loved ones. And I think it especially struck me because of so much of my career. I've been in the killing fields of Cambodia, the battlefields of Beirut. I've been in Bosnia and Kosovo, Afghanistan, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and so many of the global hotspots. And always I knew I could come home. My home, a land of security and a land of peace. And this altered that reality. And I cried. And I cried when I visited a partner of Mercy Corps who runs the president of the first socially responsible investment fund, Pax World Fund. Their offices are on Wall Street, right across from the stock exchange. And when I walked in, all of the carpet had been ripped up because of the dust from the collapsing buildings. And the people were dislocated and seemingly in shock. And I went up to Tim and I said, Tim, I know you had many friends and colleagues in those buildings, and we're with you. And he said, Neil, there are 1,000 stories in New York, and I have one. My son was on the 103rd floor of the second building. And as soon as the plane hit the first building, he went down to the 79th floor, which is, for those of you who've been there, it was where the atrium is with elevators. Long lines were there. Just as he arrived, the loudspeaker announced, it's all clear, and everyone may return to their offices. He started to go up and noticed an elderly woman in the corner who was panicked. And he went up to her and he said, can I help you? And she said, I really want to get down. I'm afraid. Can you help me? But there were long lines at the elevator. And he said, well, you know, I'm kind of worried about my dad over on Wall Street, so I'll help you down. And so he proceeded to help her down. The second plane hit, and they were 4 floors below. They struggled through the dust, the darkness, the dim light to make it down. He apparently put her on his back and carried her down. And they escaped out of the building, and 5 minutes later, the tower came crumbling down. And Tim looked at me and he said, Neil, we ask each other why. Why did he survive? But I can tell you this, I've never been as close to my son as I am now. And here was this stereotypical New Yorker investment banker, and he was just crying. And I was crying right there with you. I got to tell you, I was crying right with him. And you know, in many ways, this national tragedy has connected us all to a seamless web of caring and compassion, and reminds us of the better angels inside us all. But I have to tell you too, I'm crying now for Afghanistan. My heart is broken for Afghanistan and for its people. And that's what I mainly want to talk to you about today. Mercy Corps has been in Afghanistan since 1984. We witnessed the Soviet invasion and its resistance. We've seen the ferocious interfighting that followed. We saw the entrance of the Taliban and some of the early hopes that were quickly dashed. And we've seen the years of drought that have plagued the country for so long. And I really believe it's so important for Americans to understand the suffering of the Afghan people. And when you hear Afghanistan, I want you to think of the people and their suffering, not of bin Laden and his terrorist networks, and not of the Taliban. Because no country on the planet currently suffers more than Afghanistan. Years of Soviet occupation, internal fighting, and season after season of drought have left this country an impoverished, beleaguered basket case. It ranks #1 on the Human Misery Index. This is this index that the UN and we aid agencies use to measure suffering and poverty among nations, and it ranks #1. It's a failed state in which social, education, and health services have collapsed. Now bear with me while I run through some of the statistics, these grim statistics, and forgive me, but I think it's important we understand. Afghanistan has produced 3.5 million refugees, mostly in Pakistan and Iran. It's the world's largest refugee population and comprises 33% of the total refugees in the world. Another 1 million Afghans are placed inside their country, having fled their homes in search of food, water, and security. 1.5 million Afghans have been killed, about the same number maimed and wounded as a result of war. Afghanistan has the highest percentage of amputees and paraplegics of any country in the world, primarily because of the more than 6 million landmines that lurk beneath its soils. But there's more. Afghanistan has the highest infant mortality rate in the world. What that means is that more children, as a percentage of the population, die before they reach the age of 1 than in any other country. It has the highest child mortality rate in the world. For every child born, for every 4 children born, 1 child will die before he or she reaches his 5th birthday, primarily due to measles and diarrhea, simple, preventable diseases. And that particularly hits home because this Sunday we celebrate the 5th birthday of my own daughter. More moms die giving birth in Afghanistan than in any other country. The life expectancy rate for men is 47 years, for women is 45 years. Only 10% of the population has access to clean drinking water. Only 16% of the women can read. And the average person lives on less than 70 cents per day. The devastating drought of the last 4 years has destroyed 2/3 of the wheat crop, 3/4 of the livestock, and uprooted another 1 million Afghans in search of food and water. Today, 5 million Afghans depend directly on international humanitarian assistance for their basic needs, and 4 million depend directly on food aid to ward off starvation and hunger. In Afghanistan today, one sees desperate groups of people roaming the countryside, begging for food and money, eating wild plants and insects, and sometimes discarded animal parts. And these are the hallmarks of a pending major famine. These are the images that haunt the soul and scar the psyche. For the past several years, the international aid community has been the lifeline of Afghanistan. And now this lifeline has been cut. All the international aid workers have been withdrawn to Pakistan and neighboring countries. By some estimates, there's less than 1 week of food supply inside the country. We, the United Nations, the donor governments, the NGOs like Mercy Corps, are doing our best to get help inside the country through our local Afghan staff. We have 200 Afghan staff that are still in the country and doing their best to help their own people. And we're planning for a worst-case scenario of up to 1.5 million more Afghans who may flee to the borders of Pakistan and neighboring countries. But what we know is that the poor, the impoverished, and the most vulnerable are the ones who don't even have the resources to be able to flee. The sick children and their moms, the amputees, the elderly. But the aid workers there are really determined to help. And it's not just because and the incredible, the legendary hospitality of the Afghan people. We have experienced the warm, insisting smiles of our Afghan hosts beckoning us to come into their simple huts or homes for a cup of tea or for a simple meal. And we know that we're often served the only scrap of meat or fresh apricots that are in the house. But we know that they are so proud and would be so offended if we refused to eat. Former Peace Corps volunteers of the 60s and 70s recall Afghanistan with such fondness. And they talk about how they left a big piece of their heart and joy, of their hearts and their souls inside the country. They talk about it as such a warm and open, if not exotic, place. So many of the educated and the skilled have left the country or were driven out by an oppressive occupation or repressive regimes. But the independent, warm spirit of the people remains. Let me read you this message from an Afghan following the tragedy. I want to ask you to pass this message to other Americans who are deeply shocked. This came from inside the country. The people of Afghanistan themselves who are hostages of terrorists, and in no way do the Afghan people share the act which may have been carried out by someone misusing Afghan territory. They are sharing the pain of American people because of this terrorist act. My deepest condolences and best regards. Mohammed. You know, even the reality of the Taliban is more complex than the black and white picture often painted today. The fact is that in the early days, the Taliban brought a modicum of security that the countryside had not seen in 15 years. By most accounts, including our own, they cut back poppy production and slowed the heroin trade. And compared to the so-called Northern Alliance, no choir boys themselves, they were seen as less corrupt. But the more fanatical elements of the Taliban, with their backward, repressive beliefs and obscene treatment of women, especially in the cities, gradually won out. Now the time is short for the people of Afghanistan. Conditions are tough and insecure for workers inside Afghanistan and for aid teams in Pakistan. Just last week, one of our relief drivers inside Afghanistan was killed. He was delivering relief supplies to a remote rural village in the mountains, and his truck overturned on one of these dirt, windy, mountainous roads. He made it alive to the local clinic, only to die a day later because of no blood supplies and no proper medical supplies. He left behind 3 daughters. You know, I wish that the Star Trek somehow existed in this world and we could have zapped over the enormous outpouring of help from the American people and all the blood that's been collected here, because that would have saved his life. Some Mercy Corps offices and that of other aid organizations have been taken over by the Taliban now inside Afghanistan. But I can tell you that our Afghan staff inside are determined to keep open the network of hospitals and health clinics that are serving just under 400,000 people, especially women and children. In Islamabad, the United Nations received this warning. It read, and it was written in Arabic, "For every Taliban killed by America, we will kill a foreigner, starting with the United Nations and the NGO aid workers." It's sobering, but I can tell you we will not be deterred. Friends, the Afghan people can take no more suffering. They need our help now more than ever. Some have even suggested that we carpet bomb Afghanistan with food and medicine, blitzkrieg it with troops of doctors, engineers, and teachers, rebuild the infrastructure and show the Afghan people the compassion of the world. I wish it were this simple. But there is a truth here. And just yesterday, President Bush announced a $320 million aid package for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the region. I'm proud of our country for doing this. It's the right thing to do. And I'm proud that Mercy Corps was named as among the first partners of this aid. You know, and it just may be that providing the simple requirements of life will do more to restore sanity to Afghanistan and to undermine the bad guys than all the bullets and bombs. As we pursue justice against those responsible for these crimes against humanity, and as we take steps to prevent further despicable horrors, we must exercise great care to avoid the loss of still more innocent life or to create new mad martyrs. Sustained military action inside Afghanistan will, in all likelihood, cause mass starvation and countless casualties, especially for vulnerable children, women, and the elderly. And it could trigger an expanded refugee crisis of such massive proportions as to destabilize surrounding countries, especially Pakistan, with its nuclear bombs. The stakes are high, the moral, humanitarian, and political challenges so enormous. From my perspective, and based on extensive experience in that part of the world, and as noted earlier, throughout the Middle East, our efforts will only be successful if we redress the root causes and conditions of terrorism and such depravity, on which terrorism and such depravity breed: abject poverty and social inequality, violence and conflict, ignorance, despair, and disease. And I have to go on, particularly from my experience in that part of the world. And forgive me, because I know this is often controversial in this country. We cannot stand on the sidelines while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict spirals further and further out of control, ever intensifying as an underlying force which drives the growing tendency toward terrorism. We cannot allow Sharon and Arafat to continue to pursue the identical mad policy of tit-for-tat reprisals with more dead and wounded on every side every day. And we cannot allow the Israeli public to become ever more traumatized by fear of sudden death and the vision of an all-out, all-Muslim world campaign to destroy the state of Israel. We cannot allow the Palestinian people to sink ever deeper into jobless economic misery in a series of isolated enclaves divided by roads between Israeli settlements, their national aspirations frustrated. America's ties to Israel are indeed strong and lasting, but they can't be based upon illusion about the true state of things for both Israelis and Palestinians. Life for both peoples is more and more unbearable. There are rights and wrongs on both sides. There's pain and suffering and anger and hatred for all. And this cannot go on. When this tragedy happened, I was overseas, and I made my way to London. And I'll never forget Friday, September 14th. I stood outside of St. Paul's Church in London at 11 a.m. It was a time when all buses, all cars, all subways, all trucks, all movement stopped for 3 minutes of silence. Everyone prayed and reflected and remembered together. I prayed in silence, holding the hands of strangers around me. I felt a deep and moving connection with those around me, with my family and friends an ocean away, and with my Maker. Perhaps this tragedy has a redeeming side, one that is causing us all to hit the pause button, to find space for reflection in our busy, hectic lives. And in this abiding, spiritual space, we are rediscovering and reaffirming the values and connections that truly matter. We are renewing our commitments to make our communities better places for everyone, regardless of race or religion. And perhaps, just perhaps, we're finding a deeper understanding of our connections in this world, a firmer conviction that a world in which 50 million people are refugees from war and persecution, and 40 million of these are women and children, a world in which 25 million children have been killed, maimed, or made homeless in the past 10 years, a world in which 35,000 children die daily from hunger and disease, most of it preventable, is a moral outrage that does not permit us to stand on the sidelines of history. There is truly a seamless web of compassion that connects a homeless child in Portland, and I really believe this, with a desperate, starving child in Afghanistan. That when one child is helped anywhere, all of God's children can rejoice. And in this discovery, in this connection, a better Portland, a better America, and a better world will emerge. Thank you.
As most people who know me can attest, I'm usually not at a loss for words, but under conditions like this, where so many people have been deprived of liberty, and we can look around our own nation and see places where we haven't really done a real swift job of taking care of liberty and equality. Where do we start? I'd like to be able to say, let's wave a wand and make the whole thing better everywhere. But where realistically do we start? I got to the age of 41 and I finally grew up on September 11th, and I didn't want to grow up, but I did. What do I do now?
Dan, you're part of one of the most noble missions there is, which is educating our children and finding better ways to educate them. And if there's ever something we should all be concerned about now, that's it. So that our children will grow up with the values of tolerance, the values of diversity, and a love of freedom that will carry them in our own country and where they'll see those connections to the rest of the world.
My name is Dememo Hika. I'm speaking, I guess I'm one of the young guests from Reed College.
I thought they were referring to me.
I was curious about the possibilities of joint action between military and aid personnel. I've heard that there have been a lot of threats onto aid personnel from the Taliban. My main curiosity was that what are possible military options to help aid organizations get into Afghanistan? And do you think that these organizations, or do you think these possibilities are actually workable possibilities within the situation given what it is now?
That's a good question. The humanitarian agencies, as you can imagine, the UN, the NGOs, we have a very tentative and uncertain relationship with the military. You know, at times we've called for their assistance, particularly for the security of people and to ensure open corridors of aid. On the other hand, the military has their job to do and we have our job to do, and the two don't often overlap. Where the military and where discussions have gone on could possibly be used with humanitarian assistance is by dropping food inside Afghanistan, particularly in remote areas. As I mentioned, by some accounts, there's less than a week's worth of food supply inside the country. We know that in the northern mountains, it's going to be even more desperate because by mid-November, the passes will close with snow. And so there's the very real danger of a major famine inside Afghanistan, one that we hope to avoid. And in this situation, the military may be called upon because of the dangers to take the lead in dropping food inside the country.
Nikki Lynch, member. I have a friend who lives in Peshawar and is a Pakistani, and I got an email from her today which I found very disturbing in the sense that she said she thought that, yes, Americans were very kind, but that our government was was evil, and that this was all a plot, and felt, totally convinced because all the aircraft carriers, et cetera, are all around that war is inevitable and that there's no hope. And I'm wondering if that's a perception that you think is a common perception there, and if there's an answer I can give her that is convincing.
Well, I certainly don't think that war is inevitable out there. I think we're already seeing some early signs inside Afghanistan of a lot of disarray and a lot of chaos. And it may be that in that disarray and in that chaos, circumstances will come about that enables justice to be exacted without major military action. And I have to say, from what I've seen, from what our team in Washington has seen, the conversations that we're having with U.S. government officials, it seems that very great care is being taken to avoid the kind of military action that would cause the loss of additional innocent lives, that could create a refugee crisis of such mass proportions as to undermine Pakistan in particular, and that I think there's a real recognition that the Pakistani government is in a difficult place, and particularly in Peshawar in the northwest province frontier, which is a Pushtun area. And the Pashtuns in particular identify with their Pashtun cousins and brothers and sisters inside Afghanistan. So it's very complicated, but I don't think that war is inevitable.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. I commend you and Mercy Corps for what you're doing. You provide the best side of America, the best side of our United States. I'm reminded of what Harry Truman said at one time. It seems like the buck stops at Osama bin Laden. What is your idea if instead of trying to bomb and get him with commandos or whatever, if we were to turn over proof to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and have him brought before that tribunal, just like, for instance, Milosevic has been done? What do you think of that?
I think given if he can be directly linked to acts of terrorism on these soils and with respect to the World Trade Center, I think the proper place for justice is in our own courts. I think had those acts of terrorism occurred and perhaps some other incidences overseas, then The Hague would be the perfect place. At the same time, we, along with the rest of the international humanitarian community, have encouraged our government to recognize The Hague as a legitimate world court and to take steps to sign the treaties that most of the world has already signed before us now. But I have to say, we have to be careful putting too much of the attention on bin Laden. Bin Laden is real, but he's also a symbol. And we have to remember that if we're going to make real progress in this struggle, it has to be by addressing so many of the root causes and conditions that don't cause terrorism. I really think that's wrong to say it causes it. But it's these conditions on which terrorism and such depravity breed. And until we can address that all over the world, at home and abroad, if we get rid of bin Laden, there will be 5 more that will come on. So we have to exact justice and recognize that a lot of what we're dealing with is linked to root conditions and root suffering.
We have a country where 86% of the women cannot read, and there is no television, and there is no free press, and there is no internet. What ways are there that you might suggest where we can potentially start establishing communication with the oppressed in Afghanistan, who is most of the population? How do we get to them? Oh, by the way, I'm Joe Smith, City Club member.
Thank you. You know, it's very difficult right now. But I have to say the best way is through humanitarian engagement. Because when we are all there, we have our computers. We have our connections to the internet. There are some today, Afghans, who have their underground connections to the internet as we speak. They risk their lives when every time they go online, but they're trying to stay in touch with the outside world. But through the engagement with the international humanitarian community, I think we were seeing staff and others become aware of a wider world than they had previously were not aware of. And let's not forget also, there are lots of radios inside Afghanistan, and there are many homes and houses who have the radio smuggled under. And they listen to regional broadcasts, and they listen to BBC. In fact, we have a little book that one of our staff members produced. She's an anthropologist, and they went and talked to Afghan rural women. And I hope it's back here somewhere for any of you. I understand that it's sold out at PALS very quickly. But it was one of the first efforts to really hear from the voices of Afghan women, particularly rural women. And many of these women talk about that they've learned that there's more to their current state through the BBC and through the Voice of America. And I think that is so very important. I mean, as we know, one of the things that caused the transformation of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union were all of the forms of communication and connection that went on. And I think because of that, we saw a transformation, not perfect, but without the kind of overwhelming violence that so many people predicted.
Hi, Ann Bardicke, City Club. I have two questions. I'll try and keep them short. The first one has to do with the Northern Alliance. I wonder if you could comment a little bit more extensively on exactly who these people are and what a government would look like under their leadership, if that's what it came to. And the second one is, do you have any concerns about some of the alliances that we're having to make with some pretty unsavory regimes like Sudan, Iran, Syria, Somalia, in order to get this great coalition going?
Those are tough questions. They're good questions. And there are probably people in this room who can address who the Northern Alliance are better than I can. Essentially, the Northern Alliance are the remnants of the Rabbani government that was in power with Massoud, who we heard about, a charismatic leader who was assassinated just prior to the tragedy, along with many of the other ethnic groups and opposition forces against the Taliban. Based on their previous history of ruling and governing, I don't think we should be very sanguine about their ability to rule and govern Afghanistan. There was a lot of corruption. I think the New York Times had a story this morning that talked about the level of poppy production and heroin that's coming out of the Northern Alliance. So I think we have to be very, very careful in embracing them as the saviors, as the new form of government. In fact, there's a women's organization based out of Pakistan with followers inside Afghanistan who said the other day that while they have no love for the Taliban, in fact, they despise their rule and despise their view of women, it would almost be a step backward if the Northern Alliance were to take power again. On the other hand, there are a lot of efforts, and some people are coming forward now and joining forces loosely with the Northern Alliance in the hopes that a broader coalition can be put together that represents the real hopes and aspirations of the Afghan people. In terms of unsavory ties with other nations, you know, I'm such a big believer of engagement, whatever the country is, and that whenever you cut ties, you miss so many opportunities to transform, to change, and to learn. And it often strikes me as sometimes morally arrogant to not deal with someone for this reason or that reason. I think the key is to be engaged, but be clear and stay firm on our real commitment to human rights and our real commitment that many alliances are tactical, not necessarily strategic, and that as we reach out, we look to bring about a world order more based on human rights, more based on justice, more based on that so many of poor, impoverished, disenfranchised folks, particularly in some of these countries that you named, will have a voice in their civil society and a voice in their government.
Hi, my name is Liana Foxvogue. I'm a student at Reed College. And just as you were saying that we should create a world order more based on human rights, you were also saying earlier that we need to address the root causes and conditions of terrorism and poverty at home and abroad. And I think these are all really key issues. So my question is, how do we do this besides, in addition to sending humanitarian food aid and health care, which I see more as addressing the symptoms of the problems rather than the causes? So how do we address the causes? Thank you.
That's a great question. There's no magic blueprint or easy answers for bringing about justice or for addressing these root causes. But I tell you, it starts with a long-term commitment. Part of the reason that Afghanistan has gone through the problems it has gone, as many of us know, is there was a lot of effort on the part of the United States, Pakistan, and other countries to build up a resistance against the Soviet occupation and invasion. And once that resistance was successful, much of the aid evaporated. The real commitment to supporting building a civil society in Afghanistan, to bringing about a pluralistic base in which all of the various ethnic groups and tribal factions could have a voice, it disappeared. And for so long, the suffering of Afghanistan was hidden until it's now come home in our face so vividly today. Well, I think this is true everywhere in the world. It takes a long-term commitment and engagement on the part of the donor countries, the United States and Europe, all over the world to address those root causes. There are no quick fixes or fast exits anywhere. But just remember, the United States spends less than 1% of its gross national product on foreign aid. And there was a survey done once. Many of you have heard of this. There was a survey done once, and has asked the American people how much they thought was going to foreign aid, and people said, oh, probably about 20%. And well, what do you think is a good ratio? What do you think we ought to give? What would you be willing to give? And most people said, oh, 5 to 10% would be great. And the reality is it's less than 1%. And I think all over the world we have to renew our commitment to these issues and to these causes. And it's only through that that we'll be able to tackle those very difficult and perplexing root causes.
Hi, my name is Charles Wiggins. I'm a City Club member, and I just got back from India a couple of days ago. And in that country, one of the huge questions that's causing a lot of concern is the stationing of American or Allied ground troops in either Pakistan or India. Do you have a feel for what the reaction in the northern parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan would be of the stationing of American ground troops in that region?
I have a feel, and I think there would be widespread opposition, and it would be very tough for the government there to manage that if there were very visible and large-scale presence of American troops there. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I think our government is aware of that. And I think that would only happen as a measure of last resort. And if we saw that happening, we would recognize that there's a serious crisis in the making.
Jefferson Smith just signed up for City Club membership.
Great, all right.
Thanks in part to you. My question is, there was a part of Ray's question that I didn't want to get missed, and that is not merely whether or not war is inevitable, but also the impression of the Afghan people, not in terms just of whether or not war will happen, but their impression of the states, the United States, and the future of our relations with those countries. Because somewhere there's a 7-year-old boy, and that 7-year-old boy is developing his worldview, and he is going to have to make a decision at some point whether or not he will sacrifice his own life so that American citizens will die. And I am concerned about the development of that 7-year-old boy and the views in the country that might affect that. And I'd like to hear about that.
Another great question. You know, for so many years, Afghanistan and its people have had such a close relationship with the American people. And as I mentioned, you talk to any Peace Corps volunteer who was there in the 60s or 70s, and they left so much of their hearts and souls inside the country, and they were transformed, maybe far more because of their experience in Afghanistan than because of what they gave to Afghanistan. So there's deep and enduring bonds. And if you talk to our 200 staff who are inside, or the hundreds of staff who work for the aid agencies, or the many thousands of people who have suffered through the last years, there is still a looking to America. There's still a looking to a wider world to show that it cares. But there's been a phenomenon, and I think it links this issue of addressing root causes, the underlying social issues, and it was referred to earlier. You know, Afghanistan and Pakistan have had a rich history of Islamic schools. They've been such an important part of the culture and such an important part of the fabric of life there for years and years and years. But what has happened, particularly in parts of the northwest province frontier of Pakistan, in the Baluchistan area and inside Afghanistan, is many of the religious schools were in a sense, co-opted by more fanatical elements, by those with a narrow, perhaps backward-looking view of Islam, which has been so disputed by many scholars. And one of the reasons that so many children go to these schools is because of the poverty, because of the boycott inside Pakistan, the state of public education has collapsed. And I can't tell you how many parents have come up and have said, I wish we didn't have to put our sons in these schools. But they're our only alternative. It's either this, where he can at least learn to read and learn some religious education and hopefully come out not too brainwashed, or it's no school at all. Now that is an awful choice, and that's a choice that we can do something about. Absolutely. So I say it's a mixed case, but I think right now most 7-year-old boys inside Afghanistan right now, and if we do the right thing, will grow up with the right values and with the right heart and with an appreciation for the wider world, including the people of America. Thanks.
Betsy Warren, City Club member. I've been so appalled by the stories that we hear of the treatment of women under the Taliban, and I wish you could speak more about that and what it's might be like to live in the house with the windows painted over and no longer be allowed to work. Thanks.
You know, I can certainly speak about it. There's some of the Mercy Corps team here who could speak more vividly about it, because, you know, when I travel there, I don't get to see very many women. I don't get to go into many of the houses or have a chance to ever talk to a woman alone. It's very, very difficult, an Afghan woman, but many of our staff are here have. I will say this, that it's a very complex kind of picture. Afghanistan has always been rural Afghanistan has always been very conservative and very traditional. And life in many of the rural areas has not changed that much for many, many years. And especially in parts of the South where the Taliban felt more secure, the traditional ruling structure has been allowed to reemerge, the village elders and so forth. And while we may disagree with some of those customs and some of those norms, it hasn't changed that much with the Taliban in those areas. For the cities, it's been a completely different kind of picture, and especially in non-Pushtun areas where the Taliban is not their natural basis. There, the treatment, and I can't think of any other word, and forgive me because I don't like to do it other than to call it obscene and oppressive and wrong. And it needs to change. But I think we have to recognize that it's been a more complex kind of picture than is often presented in the media or in the sound bites on TV.
Ruth Curry, a City Club member. You may have already addressed this since I was a few minutes late in getting here. Did you address anything about the bomb and the prospect of anything happening there?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
About the bomb in Pakistan. Did you address anything? Is that any kind of a risk? The nuclear bomb. Sorry.
I did refer to it, not in depth.
I'll listen tonight. The other question, I'm going to tape record it for this session for somebody. The second question is that so much has been word from the Taliban about our morals. What can we do to change the way that we're behaving towards that, or education of that area about what we stand for? Is that impossible?
Those are great questions. Let me just, I think there is a great worry that if Pakistan were to become destabilized, and if there was some kind of an overthrow of the government and a more radical Islamic element came into being, it would increase tensions in the region significantly because of the Pakistan-India environment and because of the ongoing fighting up in Kashmir. I think many people have observed that probably the two places in the world that could still go nuclear, as awful as that sounds, is Pakistan, India, and in the Korean Peninsula. So it is a worry, and it is a concern. Regarding that question, you know, it's very difficult because there is so much propaganda that's allowed to go out through some of these religious schools, through some of the media that exist in that part of the world. And it is so irrational and so insane and so crazy in its depiction of America and our depravity and of the West and its depravity as to not be taken seriously, and yet it is widely distributed. Again, all I would say, two things. One is that if we really seriously address the root causes, then that kind of propaganda will no longer find fertile ground for belief. It just won't happen. People will know better. But secondly, I would say, and I think Tom Friedman addressed that. I don't know if any of you all saw one of his articles a couple days ago in the New York Times. And he talked about, and he said, you know, if you ever really doubt the spirit of America, and if you doubt our real strength, it's not to be found in the World Trade Center, symbols of wealth, nor is it to be found in the Pentagon, symbols of power. It's to be found in dusty, dilapidated halls in our schools, and in our PTA meetings, and in our teacher, parent, children's kinds of conferences. That's the real strength, and that's the real spirit of America. And I really believe that if we can somehow reconnect with those values, if we can reconnect with the things that truly matter, and if we can do it with a deeper understanding of the world in which we live in and the connections there, then those kinds of issues, they'll never go away. And we won't remove all of the sources of hate or of violence, but I tell you, we'll go such a long, long way to make our world a better place here, in our country, and throughout the world. I really believe that.
Guinevere Milius, City Club member. You mentioned devoting more dollars to humanitarian aid worldwide, coming from America's gross domestic product. Are there other political changes that you see America needing to make to approach the world in a more humanitarian rather than military security posture?
In 30 seconds or less. Right?
You're not more than that.
Yeah, thank you. You know, that's complicated, and, you know, and I certainly would agree with certain policies and disagree with many others. But I'm not sure that's at the heart of the matter. You know, when you have an opportunity to work with some of our government officials, our official aid folks in the U.S. Agency for International Development, even some of the military folks, you recognize that they're human just like all of us. And they're asking many of the same questions, and they're often trying to do the right thing. What I think the big picture issue is less individual policies, and we could have long discussions on that. And I alluded to some of those that I wish we would be more engaged in my speech. I think we absolutely can't stand back with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the longer it goes on, and the longer the insane madness goes on in that part of the world, the more we're going to fuel some of these seeds of terrorism. But beyond that, I think so much of it has to do with our own attitudes, with a recognition of the connections of our place in the world. For so long, Americans have been isolated. And Europeans have commented on this. I mean, we are wonderful doers, and we are wonderfully naively optimistic sometimes. But we also are unaware of the impact of our culture, the impact of our music, of the McDonald's, of the Disneys, that just invade and pervade so much of the world. We're unaware of how the global system is the global economic system, which has a mixed bag. In many ways, it's created more wealth for more people than any other system imaginable. On the other hand, we have these growing inequalities and despair within countries that's absolutely atrocious. But I think if we start to recognize more and more, all of us, starting with the children in our schools, and if the new awareness we're gaining now of our role and place in the world, I have a feeling that through the democratic process, through our elections, these policies will begin to correct themselves. And that's the essence, I believe.
This will be our last.